Well, Oregon was, in some senses, a really ideal state for McCarthy. The state was quite suburban in a sense. It was homogeneous. It was easy to reach people by television because the population wasn't that big, and television and radio went everywhere. Television was cheap. Newspaper ads were not that expensive. The people had a high educational level. People out there were interested in what we have come to call grassroots politics. And they had begun organizing quite early. His first day there, he outdrew Bobby in the same place that Bobby had been the week before that. He had a tremendous turnout. And Sorensen and Kennedy were all saying that Eugene McCarthy was no longer a force in politics, that he was finished and he was washed up. This was behind Robert Kennedy's refusal to debate. We managed it so that wherever Kennedy spoke, there was always a contingent of people saying, "Why won't you debate?" I think it was a great tactical error on the part of the Kennedy forces. And its climax came at the Portland Zoo. McCarthy was already out there, wandering around, and Kennedy had been there before him. But as McCarthy heard that Kennedy was going back to his automobile to return to Portland, he began to hurry up.
Senator McCarthy, you got about 100 feet or 150 feet from Bobby Kennedy today. What's going on?
Well, I wasn't pursuing him. I was going about my appointed rounds. He just fell behind a little bit. We were prepared to overrun him, but he escaped.
Well, I think he felt exhilarated suddenly by the fact that there were a lot of people who were turning out to hear him, and it looked as though finally he had a following.
I think Senator Kennedy had reached a point where he decided that he couldn't be himself, and he began to want to be me.
I said to McCarthy that one reason it was difficult for me to remain with him was that after Johnson got out, the fight was between him and Kennedy, and that the only campaign he could run would be run a campaign to attack Kennedy and to try, which the result of it would be the destruction, at least a temporary destruction of, because prophecy is very hard in politics, of Kennedy's political career. But in fact, of course, a lot of the attack would be personal, but it's possible to attack somebody very violently on issues. For example, McCarthy raised the issue of wiretapping against Kennedy.
You know, you could say, well, I'm sorry about that particular wiretap, but then you say, what about the general conception? Do you feel it's a good idea to have these lines out, or where do you draw the line in principle, not where do you draw the line on a particular case?
I think he found his basic theme in the Oregon campaign.
The policies were not the product of specific misjudgments. They grew from a systematic misconception of America and of its role in the world. And I am not convinced that the Senator from New York has entirely renounced those misconceptions, nor that the Vice President is prepared to say that the process is wrong as well as what it produces. If he did, in the case of the Senator from New York, I find it difficult to explain why he would use an endorsement by the former Secretary of Defense, who was one of the principal engineers of the policy. Neither of the other candidates has suggested that he would change either the policies of Rusk or McNamara, nor in fact that they would not have them in their administrations. We continue to call upon America to assume the moral leadership of the planet. Some of us do. An echo of John Foster Dulles, the very same presumption which Senator Fulbright has referred to as the arrogance of power.
We seek not to police mankind. We seek to inspire it. We don't want to be the world's policeman. We prefer, if you please, to be the world's teacher, doctor, humanitarian. That's our mission. But let it be clear that freedom, as John Kennedy put it, does not come cheap. You have to be willing to pay a price for it. And America has paid that price. And that's why America today is the freest country on the face of the earth and the greatest country on the face of the earth.
Humphrey spoke over television as if he lived in another age, the age of radio, as if he'd never heard of Marshall McLuhan. And yet he came within an ace of winning the election anyway. He would have beaten Nixon if Johnson hadn't been so cruel. That's okay.
So far as I can interpret what the Vice President said when he announced he was coming in, his conception of unity is a kind of homogenization of America. In a way of pretending that there are no serious problems, that we can all just be happy together and forget about differences, when there are some real and significant and substantive differences in this country which deserve our attention. As I read the approach of the senator from New York, his concept of unity is to put together an organization, if it can be called that, but to assemble pieces of America without any organic whole or without any central inspiration or without accepting common responsibility for America. He announced early in his effort that he was setting up, or his campaign was to set up 26 different kinds of committees to deal with 26 different kinds of Americans. I didn't know there were that many of us. Special committees to deal with the Polish and special committees to deal with the Italians and even one to deal with the Irish, which I thought for Kennedy to do that was a strange device.
Well, in the Oregon campaign, he had the benefit, I think, of better organization, certainly than he had in Indiana or in Nebraska. But the reason I think that he won in Oregon, there seemed always to be an independence of voters, the audiences that he addressed. They were very serious. Maybe this is a part of the political history of Oregon, which has had a history of independence. But it was an entirely different kind of audience than he pulled from that in Indiana, say.
My first return to California since I made what was generally reported as a very bad beginning of my campaign. I don't say I did it by design. I've always preferred to start a campaign rather at a disadvantage. I remember when I first ran for the Senate in Minnesota, the opposition made the mistake of saying I was totally ignorant of agriculture. After which I didn't have to prove very much, so that I've been on the way up ever since those early days here in California when the columnists began to analyze me, as you may recall. I never thought I'd favor the conservative columnists, but in those early days, the liberals all began to explain me in terms of some kind of psychological disturbance. And the conservatives attributed to me kind of simple vices like jealousy and envy and hatred. They used one or two that I thought had been forgotten. One said I was manifesting enmity, which is really, you have to go to the scriptures for that. Nobody has it anymore, but I did at one point. But I said I really hadn't minded any of it, excepting when they said I was lacking in charisma. At that time, they were comparing me to Richard Nixon and